you talk about the idea that psychosis could be one outcome, and this ties in nicely with the psychotomimetic paradigm that people used to have for psychedelics when they thought, the main thing they did was mimic psychosis. But most of the literature tends to focus on the dopamine system for psychosis, right, rather than the serotonin system. It's not as simple, again, the simple story for schizophrenia used to be it's just a dopamine disorder, but we now know it's far more complex than that. But there's interesting, you talk about kind of a few different ways of thinking about the interaction between the serotonin and dopamine system in producing these states, right?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned it. And certainly, because of the nature of the paper, we're focusing on ways where the 2A receptor might be more foundational to psychosis than we might have thought otherwise. I think one of the what captured my attention, at least in the kind of the final stages of our rewrite of our first draft, was recent studies that are showing. Well, one recent study showed that dopamine in high concentrations can act as a partial agonist at the serotonin 2A receptor. So really high concentrations of dopamine in the brain might actually activate the serotonin 2A receptor, inducing psychedelic-like signaling. Chronic dopamine enhancing drugs also can upregulate serotonin 2A receptor expression and sensitize behavioral responses to psychedelics. All this is important because low doses of dopamine enhancing drugs don't produce noticeably psychedelic or psychotic-like phenomena. If you do a little bit of cocaine, or if you do a little, like a tidbit of amphetamine, most people aren't going to have a psychotic-like response to that. Where you get your dopamine-induced psychoses is it kind of chronic in large doses of methamphetamine or other stimulants. In Parkinson's disease, it would be with kind of chronic treatment with L-Dopa, which is a dopamine precursor. And interestingly, in Parkinson's disease, because people are getting this L-Dopa for their motor symptoms, and they're having these they're having symptoms of psychosis, visual hallucinations and stuff because of the increased dopamine. Actually antagonizing the serotonin 2A receptor will ameliorate some of these psychotic symptoms. So it's interesting there. You get, some of the psychosis induced by dopamine probably is mediated by activation of the serotonin 2A receptor. And I think more work will need to be done on that front to see there. Also, we should note that this activation of the serotonin 2A receptor modulates dopamine. So the stress-induced release of dopamine is partially modulated by activation of the serotonin 2A receptor. There's only a couple studies that have shown this, but if you block the serotonin 2A receptor with kentanserin or another antagonist, you won't get the same dopamine response to a social stressor. So there's a lot of interactions here between dopamine and, the receptor of interest.
Yeah. So, I guess you always talk about these two different pathways of how these things may interact. And so on the one hand, you have, so if you're doing something like cocaine, that's boosting dopamine, and, dopamine's, this is for the audience, I know you know this, the dopamine's to do with kind of reward. And then as a result, with Parkinson's, because with reward, you need to go and seek it. It's, you need to actually do movements. It's a lack of dopamine that produces the difficulty in moving, right, in Parkinson's. So you have this dopamine supplement, effectively, that boosts dopamine levels, but if it goes too high, you can have psychotic symptoms. And then, as you said, there's a pharmaceutical, right, that I think it blocks the serotonin 2A receptor in a way that kind of has the opposite effect, or it kind of binds to
pimavanserin.
Right. Yeah. So it has the opposite effect of a psychedelic physiologically, I guess, and that seems to help with Parkinson's, or with the psychosis produced by the excess dopamine. So there seems to be this interaction. But then you also, most of the stuff we've been talking about, I guess, comes from the idea that it's the serotonin system is activated first, and then maybe there's a final common pathway, right, when the dopamine system is activated.
Yes, and although I've been wondering recently if we can't understand the common route towards psychosis, I would say and this is a potential framework, but understanding the schizophrenia pathway to psychosis with initial stress and activation of the serotonin 2A receptor, and then increasing engagement with the dopaminergic system. Whereas alternatively, you could have activation of the dopaminergic system, goal-driven behavior first, lack of sleep, mania, that then becomes psychotic, which could be actually activation of the dopaminergic system first, which then activates the 2A system. So it actually, these kind of feedback systems between the serotonin and dopamine system, and obviously glutamate is implicated everywhere here. We can't we can't say these are the only systems involved in psychosis, but it could help explain how you can actually get to psychosis from like almost opposite behavioral profiles, where like a depressed kind of disengaged schizotypal profile, or like a really excited manic kind of goal-driven profile.
Yeah, it was interesting where you made a connection in the paper between that kind of the depressive symptoms leading up to schizophrenia with a kind of the start of a spiritual quest. You made a kind of parallel there, right?
Yep. Oh, the prodromal features of psychosis, especially, so the prodrome is a period of months to years that precedes a psychotic episode, but in retrospect especially becomes noticeable, where someone disengages from previously pleasurable activities, oftentimes showing a shift of interest from like worldly interests like sex, money, job, to like spiritual pursuits. That's classic in the schizophrenia prodrome, and obviously you see that in the spiritual quest too. You have people like Francis of Assisi giving up their relatively cushy life for spiritual pursuits, or Prince Siddhartha the Buddha too kind of had this nice life, and all of a sudden it's not worth it. I would rather pursue spiritual goals.
Yeah, it's interesting as well on the mania side that, like, given that it seems to be the dopamine system, that's goal directed, right? And so with mania, you're very much
the opposite.
Yeah, it's the opposite. You're going to work really hard on whatever your projects are. It's you're not going off and living in a cave.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think and both converge on this common state of psychosis, which is dopamine driven, and the brain just gets so excited. It often ends in some type of extreme paranoia and disorganization. So it does kind of converge on this common set of.
And paranoia seems to be, what we were saying earlier, delusion to keep yourself feeling safe, coupled probably with the sense that you're stressed, something's not right. So it makes sense that you start to think, okay, so I've got to come up with a narrative that explains why I'm incredibly stressed. And actually, instead of sitting with that stress and just, I guess we're not built to just say, I'm going to accept that I feel deep kind of stress, probably from maybe some trauma or some, ambient stress you're not identifying. Instead, it's easier to tell yourself a narrative that you're being followed by the CIA or whatever it is that your paranoia is.
Absolutely. And, talking about evolved mechanisms is different here, but you can imagine in terms of vigilance, when people get very vigilant, the times naturally where you might reach a state of extreme vigilance and hyperactivity might be when you think other people are trying to trick you or deceive you, where there's some type of imminent kind of conflict that's kind of hiding beneath the surface. And so this paranoia could build on a mechanism which has evolved to kind of investigate deception in other people and protect ourselves against that. Yeah.